Okay, I'm Carla. I'm the Director of Futures of the Institute of Education at UCL, not the whole of UCL, I hasten to add. But I am involved in a big project with a lot of EdTech startups, and I have been an EdTech practitioner for about 18 years. And I've been an EdTech practitioner all over the world, well, pretty much all over the world. So I have got quite a big spectrum around what's going on, what has been going on in the EdTech world. I don't originally come from an education background, nor from a technology background. I moved into the digital domain about 30 years ago because it looked pretty enticing and really amazing, and I thought, wow, this is incredible. But I will never, ever work in education, because the problem with education is that it doesn't move. And the thing with technology is that it does move. So how can you reconcile the two? And guess what? A little bit later, I ended up finding myself in developing e-learning applications for the healthcare sector and a pharmaceutical company. And then I ended up finding myself in the education space, working in the schools market. And I was completely hooked. And I still don't quite understand why, but I was. Some of it I do understand because it's complicated. It's hellishly complicated. And EdTech is equally hellishly complicated because having worked in the domain for such a fairly long time, what I've noticed is that most EdTech developers, and I'll get to why I think that is in a minute, certainly the early generation of EdTech has always tried to retrofit into an existing education process, system, ecosystem, from looking kind of inwards and looking at what is the process a teacher goes through. Let's try and mimic this workflow and this process in our EdTech product. Boing, problem number one. You know what? Retrofitting, it really doesn't work. And in that retrofit, also the learner hasn't necessarily been considered. So what that actually has achieved is that you find a lot of early generation technology solutions in education, and they still exist today, and people are still developing them, and people are still implementing them, that actually have kind of taken education a step back because it's been totally retrofitted around that process of what happens in the classroom or a lecture theatre, and trying to make the technology work in that way. Now, what does the best technology do? It transforms. It doesn't retrofit. And so that you've got this amazing tension between the EdTech and the education system that sort of is trying to coalesce, but is not working, because by through the retrofit, actually what's happened to teachers is that they've got more work rather than less. And if you want to bring technology into the classroom, and I'm not just going to talk about the classroom, but if you want to bring technology into the classroom, a retrofit is not going to help you. And the first thing you need to look at is, okay, who are the stakeholders and what do they need? Not necessarily what do they do, what do they need? And then kind of try and come to your solution that way. It's still a problem. I've been doing it for 17 or 18 years now, EdTech. It's still a problem. It hasn't moved on very much because also we still educate in a way that we've been educating for over 100 years. And so EdTech and tradition haven't quite found a way together. However, I don't want to be completely negative about EdTech or about education, because I'm, despite the fact that I've been doing it for so long, and despite the fact that I'm finding it very hard and to find even a way through it, I'm still convinced it is the answer. Not the answer to the education problem, but it is an answer to help our learners of today grow into the digital citizens they need to be today and tomorrow. And we can't negate technology from the education space anymore, because if we do, we actually disservice that whole generation, and they will not have the skills and the acumen to really flourish and thrive in the world that they will need to thrive in. So there's quite a lot of tension in this. One of the tensions that, there's a few startups in the room that you may also find is that You know, you're developing your technology, you need money to kind of survive. You've got investors who kind of go, right, now tell me how I'm going to make money on this in 2 years' time. And you sort of scratch your head and you kind of go, 2 years' time in education? That ain't very long. And prove your impact, you know, in 6 months' time. It's just not going to happen. It is really, really not going to happen, because proving impact is A, very difficult, because what are you trying to prove? What is your before and what is your during and what is your after scenario? And how do you define that scenario to prove that impact? So one of the things that really irritates me about EdTech is that you get so many people coming to you and they say, you want to look at my EdTech solution because I have the problem for education and I'm going to solve education. And I kind of go, wow, that's great. I don't think, you know, anybody can really do that, but if you say so, which education are we talking about? You know, what space do you operate in? Are you lifelong learning? Are you early years? Are you, yes, yeah, I suppose it's more to education than just year 1 to 6 in primary school. Exactly. So, you know, you're never going to solve the education problem, and you also don't need to look at solving the education problem, but solving something quite discrete. So when sort of talking to investors and you sort of go like, okay, I'm trying to solve the education problem, because you sort of think an investor may quite like that story because, hey, that sounds really scalable and that sounds like good return on revenue, on investment. That's compelling for me. I'll invest in you. And then 2 years later, the investor comes to you and says, how is this solution and the solving of the education problem going? Where's my money? And you kind of go, you know what? I'm still at my implementation phase number 2. I still only have managed to get into 1 school, and I had to work with only half-paying customers because, you know, I want to get into the school. Boing, second problem. Investor says, well, you know, if that's the case, I might decide to go away. So it's not, you know, shy of problems. The other issue, I think, with EdTech is that so often when I talk to people who come to me and say, can you have a look at my solution because, you know, I'm trying to help solve the education problem, I so often find that the solutions are sometimes incredibly clever, amazingly technologically, you know, advanced, but actually they've got no connection to learning and teaching. You know, and they're engineering driven, they're technology driven, they're not education driven. And unless we want EdTech to succeed, we have to start with that education piece. We have to start with, you know, who are those stakeholders in that education piece? And what are we trying to solve for them? So, and that's not just the learner, that's not just the teacher, that can also be a parent, that can be a school administrator. There are a lot of stakeholders involved in this process. And also depending on where you want to position your EdTech, the complexity of those stakeholders will become bigger or smaller. So if I kind of look at how EdTech has evolved, that's where I'm seeing the real light at the end of the tunnel. Because where people, even up to maybe 4 or 5 years ago, kind of try to solve it in one big box, there's a realization coming now that, you know what, learning and teaching has got so many different facets. Let's look at the facets and let's try and look at solving maybe one thing and not try to solve the whole thing, or not try and retrofit it to the whole thing, and try to kind of work with, you know, maybe something slightly more discrete. And that is, I think, where and people are starting to realize that, you know what, we can't just look at this anymore as an engineering solution. We need to look at this from the teacher and the learner and the pedagogical side first, and then let the technology augment and support it. And once we get that kind of combination right, that is when EdTech will start to thrive. Until we do that, EdTech is going to find it really, really hard. And it's really going to be very difficult for EdTech players to kind of succeed. The next piece in the puzzle is, if you look at schools market particularly, is that so many teachers haven't been trained around the kind of the digital space and how to absorb, you know, that digital event and the digital transformation that's happening in the world into the classroom. There's a complete disconnect. So we all consume technology like mad. Yet when you're a teacher and you're standing in front of a classroom and you're trying to deal with all the different learners in your classroom of different abilities, of different needs, and suddenly you have to kind of go, oh right, I now need to go and look at my computer because I need to assign a task to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. The connection with your learners has completely been broken because you're kind of going from, you know, what I tend to call a peripheral vision into a tunnel mode, which breaks that connection. And so that's where we need to make sure that the overheads for teachers are reduced because you can then keep the connection with your learners. And that's where, you know, as well as teacher education in kind of adopting digital technologies in a learning and a teaching environment, that's also where the smart technologies can help. Because once we get into the kind of AI side of the technologies and the smart technologies, that is where that orchestration or your virtual teacher assistant can take a lot of that teacher workload away and make sure that the connection between you and your learners continues. And those are the kind of things that I think EdTech does need to really, really think about. Be education informed, focus on the learner and the teacher, or whatever stakeholder you want to kind of engage with in your product or your service, and sort of keep that focus really, really education and user-centric. And then we're going to get somewhere. Now, what I wanted to do in this session is actually not just talk myself. I wanted actually to, you know, for people to engage in sort of an EdTech discussion, because I'm sure there are quite a few practitioners in the room, and I'm sure you're all finding things not necessarily that straightforward. So what I was keen to find out from people in the room is, you know, how they kind of see the education piece in EdTech, what tension they're finding, because I think you're probably finding that there's quite a lot of tension, and sort of see if we can engage in a discussion around it. So if anybody would like to start this. Yeah.
Hi. So one thing that I really liked was your talk about the sort of retrofitting process that happens in a lot of EdTech.
So can I ask you who you are and where you're from?
I'm Richard Tibbles. I come from a non-profit learning equality based in San Diego. We make an offline educational technology platform.
Okay.
I'm actually also an alumnus of the Institute of Education. So.
Okay. Great.
Thinking about the retrofitting aspect, I think that's something we've struggled with a lot in terms of like developing the platform, because while we want to have this transformative effect in the way that the technology is used in the classroom, to get that initial buy-in from teachers who don't want to adopt a brand new technology that's confusing and strange, and then B, at the same time, learn how to teach in it a completely different way. Some of that retrofitting, I think, creeps in at that point, and then it's a matter of trying to then iteratively change over time. Do you have any, I don't know if there's anything that you've thought about that's about where the sort of trade-off between that happens and how much has to be iterative and how much has to be a sort of cliff edge change in practice?
Okay, I think one of the bigger problems, especially if you're looking at the kind of platform technologies, is that you immediately go relatively big in terms of defining your product or your service, because you sort of have to. But what that does do then is that you have a problem because you have gone big. The kind of iteration becomes really, really difficult. And you may have gone big because you kind of haven't sort of developed it grassroots up, you know, working, you know, sort of going through a process of maybe even designing it with your stakeholders, right? Not that I am in favor of design by committee, but you do need to kind of have to get that user centricity. You do need to design with your stakeholders. And start with maybe one small component of what you're trying to achieve in your solution, and validate that and test that, and also, look at what education research and findings are out there to support what you're trying to do. Because what you don't want to do is kind of do what someone else has done before you and actually stumble over the same hurdle. You want to kind of do something slightly different. The issue you've also got, of course, is that education is also very contextual. And that makes, especially platforms quite tricky, because, what people want is, I want this platform, I want to take it all over the world, and I'm just going to localize my content. That's really tricky because of the contextual context of education. Even if you're good at localizing, even if you're, even in some countries where everything is so regional that one region may accept what you've done and the other may not. And yet, if you're going through that institutional buying model, if the institution is your customer, that is really highly problematic, because the context that you thought would apply to them does not apply to them, and therefore they're not going to go for it. So, which is again another reason why I think you need to start quite small and validate what you're doing, and then if you want to scale or go global, validate it, identify some key regions or markets for you, and then validate it in those markets. Because unless you kind of have that incremental validation process, you're not going to be able to do it, because you will actually stumble. And the context in education just can't be overestimated, which again poses a bit of a problem with those of you who might be trying to raise funds or might want investment, because your investors go, okay, so you've got your prediction, 10,000 users in year one, because I understand you need to kind of test and validate this, and you need to get going, and then you scale it up, and year two, 200,000 users, I can live with that. Can you please get me 600,000 by year three? And you kind of go, wow, how am I going to do that? Because it takes me 6 months to sell to one single school. So that is really, really problematic, and that's also why I think the smaller in a way you can be to get going and to prove what you're trying to do, the better it is. And it also gives you much more flexibility to kind of improve on what you're doing or where you got it wrong. If you're going to fail fast, fail smart, and start again. Don't build something big and then come crashing down, and you have got no way to kind of move in either direction. So that would definitely be my advice. And then also, of course, it's not just about the schools. There are other ways in which you can obviously target what you're doing. Yeah. Anybody else? Hi.
I'm coming at this from a teacher's point of view.
Yes, please.
I don't know how appropriate it is, but...
No. Everything is appropriate. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about kind of aesthetics and engagement. So there's a... So talking about aesthetics and engagement, I teach children of all ages in schools.
Yeah.
The children's expectation for technology is very high. So they're surrounded by these computer games, movies with CGI. They have very high expectations. A lot of the technology that I'm seeing in schools is clunky and below their expectations. I just want to know your opinion on how that affects maybe students' engagement, because they don't want to engage with something that's less than the games they're playing at home and things like that.
I think this is a really nice question. There's two sides of the coin. I mean, usually there are. You're absolutely right. And when I first started working in the education space and the education technology space, I was actually appalled at what I was seeing and how the kind of education technologies interfaces were designed. Because it was like, if you're not going to engage a learner and a teacher, please design it this way. Because you're definitely going to succeed on that front. You're not going to succeed on the other front, but you're going to succeed on that front. So I totally agree with you. And there are some people doing some amazing work, and more new startups are really coming up with some good designs. There's another aspect to this, though, and I'll tell you a slightly anecdotal story of, it's a few years old now. I kind of set up an innovation division for an international education publisher many moons ago. And what the CEO of the company at the time wanted to do was kind of create a virtual world for learners. This is in the UK initially, so that they can kind of help prepare their GCSE levels and their A levels, so their kind of last two top level exams before they go off to university. And so we were looking at these virtual worlds, and I thought, how the hell is anybody going to learn anything in there? And actually, they're not even really good design. Anyway, that's, you know, we were going to do a trial run. We were going to work with a bunch of GCSE students. We were going to do this. Now, guess what? We trialed it with, I think, 50 GCSE students, and they all came in, and they kind of sat down, and they looked at what we were trying to do, and they all went, "You got to be joking. You really have so got to be joking. You're asking us to get ready to, you know, be good at our GCSE levels, to make sure that we pass our GCSE levels. You're even claiming that we're going to get an extra star when we're using your technology to, you know, in our GCSE or A levels. How do you think we're going to achieve this? This is rubbish. When we need to learn, we need to learn. When we need to prepare our exams, we need to prepare our exams. Don't give us all this kind of superfluous stuff around it, because it's not helping us. It's a slightly different thing from good design and engaging design, but the argument I'm trying to make is that there's, you know, we kind of quite often assume that because technology is moving so fast, and you know, learners are some of the biggest consumers of this technology, that, you know, to kind of make sure that they can engage with the learner, we have to replicate this in the classroom. Actually, we don't, because that is not what they want in the classroom. And if you look at learners in the classroom and how they navigate platforms and things, they actually also struggle. I mean, I'm sure you must be seeing it, you know, when they struggle, because that is not how they consume technology. So they distinguish very, very clearly between the two worlds. It doesn't mean that you can't introduce gamification in some of the learning to kind of, you know, engage them. But it does mean that what you need is user-centric design, pedagogically informed, cognitively sound, you know, so that learners can learn and also teachers have the ability to teach. But don't come up with a lot of paraphernalia, because actually a learning process or a teaching process is incredibly focused. And what you want to do is you want to augment and enable that to happen. You don't want to detract by bells and whistles. You really, what you want to do is really enable this to happen. And that can only happen through good and engaging design. I totally agree with you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's a lady over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Rosemary. I work with teachers in northern part of Uganda. We are piloting in about 20 primary schools and working with about 200 teachers in integration of ICT in the teaching learning process.
Okay.
Now, at the start, most of the teachers had not had opportunity and exposure. And so bringing in technology right there, a lot of time was spent by teachers in trying to figure out how to use this and how to also locate the digital content. And yet on the part of the learners, they were very fast to get to the technology and be able to manipulate it. And these are learners aged 6 to 10 years. Now, in terms of effective integration of the ICT in the teaching learning process, we found this challenging because you look at the pedagogy and then also in terms of teachers utilizing it within the period that has been stipulated has been quite challenging. So what are some of the basic considerations to put in place for effective integration in the teaching learning process?
Okay, that's why I'm sort of really advocating that teacher education, before you even hit the classroom, has to develop that digital acumen. Because what this is, first and foremost, is a development of digital acumen that you can then kind of adopt and implement in your own professional life. And of course, you know, in most situations, that just doesn't happen. And that's not just a problem in Uganda, that is a problem worldwide. You know, the digital aspect of teaching is really most of the time not even considered, profoundly, and in a lot of cases not even superficially in teacher education. So everything has to start with there, because if you're absolutely right, if you're a teacher, you're kind of having to deal with your classroom, and suddenly someone comes in and says, okay, now you're going to use ICT, and you know what, we've got a clever platform doing all sorts of things, and just kind of make sure you can use a computer, it will be fine. No, that is not how it works. For a start, using technology in teaching and learning it's not an IT process, it's a pedagogical process. It's a teaching and learning process. And that's also where quite often a disconnect happens, because people look at it and policymakers and school management, they look at this and it's like, yes, we've got computer kit, so we need our IT people to tell our teachers how to use this. It is not an IT exercise. It needs IT support, but actually it is not an IT exercise. It's a pedagogical, it's a teaching, it's a learning exercise. And I think that has also aided to the kind of lack of integration and adoption of technology in schools, because it's kind of been too often seen as an IT problem rather than a teaching and learning problem, or a teaching and learning aid, because ultimately that's what it's got to be. It shouldn't be a teaching and learning problem, it should become a teaching and learning enabler. And so in terms of how do you solve that in the short term, I would, it's not easy, definitely not easy. The first thing I think you do need to isolate is, can the teachers actually use a computer by themselves, not immediately in the classroom, sort of get them really proficient in kind of navigating the computer and the screen. And then look at, okay, what are we doing in our teaching and our pedagogy to kind of support this teaching and learning using technology in a classroom, and work it that way around. So you kind of isolate the youth getting familiar with the technology from actually the teaching. You kind of do it in two steps. Don't try to do it all in one step. And I think that may seem that it's going to take a long time, but ultimately you get there faster. I hope that helps. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tom Lowers, and I design educational robots, and I've been doing that for a long time. And I loved your paper, and I completely agree with you that learner-centered design is critical, and that you should be including your stakeholders, teachers, and students at every step of the design process. The challenge is around educational efficacy. What government ministers want to hear, what investors want to hear is this will improve test scores by 20%. And from my experience with the learning sciences research, you can either have repeatability or applicability. You can have repeatable lab studies that provide a quantitative increase, or you can have something that is actually an intervention in a classroom, but you can't really get a quantitative metric out of that besides it worked in that classroom, under those conditions, and it increased things by 20%.
Yeah.
So given that, how do you talk with somebody who is in that quantitative metric space when really to get the science that they actually want, you'd have to conduct a $10 million study to really do it properly?
Yeah. And even then, that study might not kind of, because what's your research question? How are you isolating the question? What question, from an investor perspective, a single research question is not necessarily going to give them the answer, right? So what is the kind of angle that you are trying to address? Now, I totally agree with you with the kind of research bit, and actually at the Institute we're running a project with 246 EdTech startups that tries to kind of make the EdTech world more education research and education evidence informed. Not necessarily driven, because it shouldn't be driven that way either. It needs to come together in this triangle of research, EdTech, and educators working together to make this happen. But at least have a research mindfulness and be evidence informed. Now, in terms of your question, I think it's a really, really difficult problem because that's what people think about the introduction of technology. It's like, wow, okay, technology's here, so what are my outcomes? Now, I was saying earlier, that's so often so hard to prove because your before and after are actually apples and pears for a start. So you've got a problem there. And then, you know, once you kind of trying to extrapolate that, it gets even harder. So what I would suggest, you know, if you get asked that question is, I don't know what your robots do, by the way, so, and where your intervention is actually really focusing on the intervention or the interventions that you're working on, and sort of really observing the findings in those interventions. It might not be always scientific, but you will be able to tell a story on what you find, asking some pretty deep questions at the start. And you might not be able to say, you know what, before it was this and now it's this, because you won't have that. But at least by kind of ring-fencing some questions around it and trying to sort of identify some of the issues that you're being challenged about and how you can respond to those issues with a good narrative. And over time, you will be able to see some, proof or observational, information that is really, really valuable. That will also be valuable to your investors. But you know better than I do, in this space, you need very, very patient investors. And you need an investor of a very particular kind who has got the patience, who has got the education passion. Because if you get an investor who's got passion for education, they know it's not going to generate, a big pot of money in a very short time. They probably know it's not going to generate a big pot of money in the first place. And that's, for some investors, that's absolutely fine, because that's why they do it. But I do think whilst you're kind of developing what you're doing, you need to constantly reevaluate this and, identify some key questions for yourself in terms of what am I constantly being challenged about? How can I respond to this? And then maybe ring-fence your own little research studies around this. Yeah. I hope that sort of helps a little bit. And I think my time is up.
It is.
So thank you very much, everyone.